What if I told you that for 5 years, the most powerful racing series on Earth operated with almost no real rules? That manufacturers were essentially handed a blank check and told to build whatever nightmare machine they could dream up? That crowds of hundreds of thousands of people stood inches from cars doing over 120 miles per hour through narrow mountain roads? And that it took multiple deaths, including innocent spectators, before anyone finally said enough? This is the story of Group B Rally. 5 years. 5 glorious, horrifying, world-altering years that produced machines so far beyond what anyone thought possible that they changed automotive engineering forever and nearly destroyed the sport of rally racing in the process. We are talking about cars producing over 500 horsepower in an era when a Ferrari felt slow. We are talking about drivers threading needle-thin gaps between walls of human beings at speeds that would make your stomach drop. We are talking about corporate warfare between the biggest car manufacturers in the world, played out on dirt roads and mountain passes across Europe. And we are talking about a governing body that eventually did something almost unheard of in the history of organized sport. They didn't reform the series. They didn't tweak the regulations. They killed it. Completely. Overnight. Gone. And the cars, the Audi Quattro S1, the Lancia Delta S4, the Peugeot 205 T16, they became some of the most revered and terrifying machines ever built. Today, a genuine example of one of these cars can fetch millions at auction. And honestly, when you understand what they could do, that price starts to feel reasonable. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about Group B Rally. If you're someone who loves the intersection of insane engineering, motorsport history, and stories that feel almost too wild to be real, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the cars themselves, before we talk about the technology and the records and the legends, we need to understand the world that made Group B possible. And to do that, you need to understand what rally racing actually is, because it is fundamentally different from every other form of motorsport, and that difference is exactly what made Group B so uniquely dangerous. Look, most people picture racing as cars going around in circles. Formula 1, NASCAR, Le Mans. Even those series have their risks, but they share one critical characteristic. The track is closed, controlled. Spectators are behind barriers. Marshals are stationed at corners. Safety crews are positioned around the circuit. If something goes wrong, the infrastructure to respond is already in place. Rally is none of those things. Rally takes place on public roads, real roads, mountain passes in Corsica, forest tracks in Finland, dirt paths winding through the hills of Portugal. These stages can stretch for dozens of kilometers, and the cars race one at a time against the clock, not each other. A co-driver sits in the passenger's seat reading pace notes, calling out corners before they arrive. Left 4, right 2, tightens, don't cut. The driver memorizes nothing. They react entirely to what their co-driver tells them seconds before it happens. Here's the thing. That system works extraordinarily well under normal circumstances. Rally drivers develop a level of trust with their co-drivers that goes beyond anything most of us will experience in our professional lives. But it assumes the car stays on the road. It assumes the crowds stay back. And in Group B, neither of those assumptions held for very long. So let's go back to 1982. The FIA, the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, the governing body of world motorsport, introduced a new set of technical regulations for rally cars. They called it Group B. And on paper, it looked straightforward enough. Manufacturers needed to produce just 200 road-legal versions of whatever they wanted to race. 200 cars. That was the only real barrier to entry. Beyond that, the regulations were almost laughably open. Any engine configuration, any drivetrain layout, any aerodynamic devices, any materials. The FIA had essentially walked into the room of every major car manufacturer in the world, slapped the table, and said, "Build us the fastest thing you can possibly imagine, and we will let you race it." Now, you might be thinking, surely they had some idea of what this would produce. Surely someone ran the numbers and thought, maybe we should put a horsepower cap on this thing. Apparently not. Because what happened over the next 4 years was an engineering arms race unlike anything the motorsport world had ever seen. And it started with one company that had already been quietly building something revolutionary: Audi. Here's what most people don't realize about the Audi Quattro. When it first appeared in 1980, 2 years before Group B even existed, it was considered almost eccentric. All-wheel drive on a performance car? That was for tractors. That was for military jeeps. The performance car world ran on rear-wheel drive, and the idea that splitting power between all 4 wheels would make a car faster rather than heavier and more complicated was genuinely controversial. Audi's engineers disagreed. And they were right. On loose surfaces, on gravel and snow and dirt, the difference 4-wheel drive made was staggering. Instead of rear wheels spinning uselessly, fighting for traction while the front end pushed wide, all 4 tires were simultaneously clawing for grip. The physics were undeniable, and when Group B opened the door in 1982, Audi walked through it with a car that the competition simply could not answer. Not immediately. The original Quattro that entered Group B was already fast, but Audi kept developing, keep pushing, keep adding power and refining aerodynamics and reducing weight. And by 1985, they had arrived at something that barely deserved to share a name with a road car. The Audi Sport Quattro S1 E2. Angular, aggressive, covered in enormous wings and aerodynamic appendages that served genuine downforce purposes. A turbocharged 5-cylinder engine producing estimates ranging from 500 to 550 horsepower. In a car weighing approximately 2,200 pounds. 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. In 1985. Let that land for a second. This is where it gets really interesting. A Ferrari 288 GTO, considered one of the most exotic and desirable supercars on the planet in 1985, would run 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds. The Audi Quattro S1 E2, a rally car built ostensibly around a production vehicle, would leave it standing. And Audi wasn't even the most extreme example of what Group B had produced. That is the part that genuinely stops people in their tracks when they first start digging into this era. Because the other manufacturers had seen what Quattro was doing, and they had responded with engineering programs that matched and in some ways exceeded Audi's ambitions. Peugeot looked at the regulations and did something audacious. Rather than taking an existing road car and building a race version around it, they essentially constructed a purpose-built racing machine and then draped the body of their popular 205 hatchback over the top of it. The result was the Peugeot 205 T16. Mid-engined, 4-wheel drive, turbocharged, and producing somewhere in the region of 450 horsepower in its original form. The engine sat just behind the driver, a layout borrowed from Formula One thinking, which placed the weight centrally and gave the car handling characteristics that the front-engined Audi simply couldn't match on tighter, more technical stages. The 205 T16 was smaller, nimbler, and in many conditions, faster through corners. When Peugeot arrived on the World Rally Championship stage with this car, they didn't just compete with Audi. They beat them. Timo Salonen won the 1985 Drivers' Championship for Peugeot. The manufacturer's title followed. Audi responded by developing the S1 E2, the most extreme version of the Quattro, pushing power figures even higher and adding aerodynamic devices that made the car look more like a science fiction prop than a production-based vehicle. This is what corporate warfare looks like when you remove the suits and put it on a dirt road. Ford entered the fray with the RS200. Now, here is a car that deserves more attention than it typically receives in the Group B conversation, because the RS200 represents perhaps the most honest attempt to build a Group B car from first principles. Ford brought in engineers with Formula One background. They designed a tubular steel chassis from scratch. They placed the engine midships, like Peugeot, and developed a sophisticated four-wheel drive system that could vary the torque split between front and rear axles depending on conditions. This was genuinely advanced technology for 1986. The RS200 was also, by Group B standards, almost pretty. Where the Audi looked aggressive and the Lancia looked purposeful, the Ford had a certain rounded elegance to its body. It looked almost friendly. It was not. In full race specification, the RS200 produced around 450 horsepower, and there were evolution versions being developed that some engineers claimed would push well past 600. Those versions never raced. We will get to why shortly. But first, we need to talk about the Lancia Delta S4. Because if you were going to design a car specifically to illustrate how far Group B had departed from any reasonable interpretation of production-based motorsport, this would be your exhibit. Lancia had a long and storied history in rally racing. The Stratos, the 037, these were iconic machines that had defined eras. But when Group B arrived, Lancia understood that incremental development was not going to be enough. They needed something genuinely new. So their engineers sat down and started with the engine question. Turbocharging or supercharging? Both approaches had merit. Turbocharging provided enormous power at higher engine speeds but suffered from lag, that frustrating delay between pressing the accelerator and feeling the full effect. Supercharging responded instantly because it was mechanically driven directly by the engine, but it didn't produce the same top-end power as a turbo. Here's what the Lancia engineers decided. Why choose? They would use both. Simultaneously. On the same engine. The supercharger would handle low-speed response, eliminating turbo lag entirely and giving the driver immediate power in slow corners where rally stages are often won or lost. Then, as engine speed built, the turbocharger would take over and push power figures into a range that the supercharger alone could never reach. The result was an engine that made serious power at almost every point in the rev range. Combine that with a sophisticated four-wheel drive system, composite body panels that kept weight to an absolute minimum, and you had a machine that some engineers estimated made over 500 horsepower. Others suggested the real number was higher still. The Delta S4 was, by any objective measure, one of the most technically ambitious race cars ever constructed. And it was fast. Devastatingly, almost incomprehensibly fast on the stages where it could be fully exploited. Now, here's the thing about all of these cars. On paper, as engineering exercises, they are genuinely admirable. The ingenuity that went into each one, the problems that were solved, the innovations that were pioneered, these are legitimate contributions to automotive history. But there is a gap between what happens on paper and what happens when you put a 500 horsepower machine on a narrow mountain road with questionable surface grip, no barriers, and 100,000 spectators who have decided that the best place to watch this particular sport is standing approximately 3 feet from the racing line. And that gap, that chasm between theoretical performance and real-world context, is where Group B started to unravel. Let's talk about the spectators. Because the crowds at Group B events were not just large. They were extraordinary. In Portugal, in Finland, in Corsica, in the forests of Wales and the mountain passes of the Alps, people came out in numbers that modern sporting events would envy. The Rally of Portugal in 1986 is estimated to have attracted close to 1 million spectators across its stages. 1 million people, lining roads that were barely wide enough for 2 ordinary cars to pass each other. And here's what most people don't realize when they look at the photographs from this era. Those spectators weren't behind barriers. There were no barriers. They were standing on the edge of the road, some of them leaning out to get a better view, some of them stepping back only at the last possible second as a 500 horsepower machine arrived doing speeds that most people will never experience in an aircraft, let alone on a public road. The drivers talked about this constantly. Walter Röhrl, perhaps the most technically precise driver of the Group B era, described navigating crowd-lined stages as threading a needle at 200 kilometers per hour with human beings as the eye of the needle. Think about what that actually means. You are traveling at speeds where your reaction time is essentially irrelevant. By the time your brain registers an obstacle, you have already passed it or hit it. You are trusting your co-driver's pace notes, your car's mechanical integrity, and the collective decision-making of thousands of strangers to all work perfectly simultaneously. Every single time. Stage after stage. Rally after rally. Roral was famously one of the more cautious Group B drivers, and I use the word cautious in the loosest possible sense when applied to a man driving a 500 horsepower car through a crowd on a mountain road. His caution was relative to some of his contemporaries, who seemed to operate with an almost philosophical indifference to the possibility of catastrophic failure. Roral was measured and calculating. That measured approach probably saved his life. Others were less fortunate, and we will get there. But first I want to spend a moment on what it was actually like to be inside one of these machines, because the clinical horsepower figures and the weight statistics only tell part of the story. Imagine sitting in a barely padded racing seat, surrounded by a roll cage that exists specifically because the engineers building this car accepted as a baseline assumption that it would crash. The engine is behind you, which means the noise is not in front of you where your brain expects it. It is surrounding you, vibrating through the seat, through the steering column, through the floor. The turbocharger is spooling with a sound like a jet engine winding up for takeoff. Your co-driver is reading notes into your ear at a pace that sounds conversational but is actually a precisely calibrated stream of information that you are processing faster than conscious thought. Left 4 over crest, don't cut, tightens to right 2, long right 6. You don't have time to think about what any of that means. Your hands and feet are already responding before the words have fully arrived. Now add the knowledge that on both sides of the road, separated from your trajectory by sometimes less than a car's width, there are human beings. Families. Children. People who drove hours to stand here and watch you pass in a fraction of a second. That is the reality of Group B. Not the statistics. Not the engineering diagrams. That specific, visceral, deeply human reality of what these drivers were doing every single time they left a service park and entered a special stage. Here's the thing about extreme circumstances. They reveal character with a clarity that ordinary life never quite manages. And the Group B era produced characters who remain among the most compelling figures in motorsport history. Stig Blomqvist, the quiet Swede who won the 1984 World Championship for Audi, was known for a smoothness behind the wheel that seemed almost supernatural given the machinery he was managing. Markku Alén, the Finn who drove for Lancia with a commitment that occasionally bordered on recklessness, was beloved for his attacking style and his willingness to push when other drivers would consolidate. Michèle Mouton, the French driver who became the first and to this day only woman to win a round of the World Rally Championship, did so in a Group B car. In 1982, driving the Audi Quattro, she won 4 rounds of the championship and finished second in the drivers' standings. In Group B, against the best male drivers in the world, in machines that punished the slightest error without mercy. That achievement deserves more recognition than it typically receives. And then there was Henri Toivonen. Born in 1956 into a Finnish rally dynasty, his father Pauli had been a successful rally driver, and Henri seemed to have inherited not just the family profession but some additional gift that went beyond training or technique. People who drove with him and against him speak of a naturalness behind the wheel that was genuinely rare, a quality that the best drivers possess and that cannot be taught. He had first come to widespread attention in 1980 when, driving a relatively modest Talbot Lotus, he won the Rally of Great Britain, one of the most demanding events on the calendar. He was 24 years old. The performance announced him as someone exceptional. By 1985, driving for Lancia, he was widely considered one of the 2 or 3 fastest rally drivers on the planet. His car control in the Delta S4, a machine that even experienced drivers found intimidating, was described by engineers and team officials in almost reverential terms. He made it look easy. That is the most dangerous thing a difficult machine can do. Make itself look easy. Because it creates a false impression of the margin available. The margin in a Group B car on a mountain road was never as large as it looked from the outside. Now, this is where the season of 1986 begins. And I want to be precise about the timeline here because the speed with which events unfolded that year is itself part of what makes this story so devastating. The 1986 World Rally Championship opened in Monte Carlo in January. The cars were at their most extreme. Development had continued through the winter. The manufacturers arrived with machines that were measurably faster than anything from the previous season. The stages were the same stages they had always been. The crowds were larger than ever. The safety infrastructure was essentially identical to what it had been years earlier, when the cars were producing perhaps half the power they were now generating. Look, the warning signs had been accumulating for some time before 1986. There had been serious accidents in previous seasons. Cars had gone off roads. Spectators had been endangered. Drivers had raised concerns through official and unofficial channels. The FIA had responded with statements and minor regulatory adjustments. But the fundamental tension at the heart of Group B, between the extraordinary capability of the cars and the real-world environments in which they raced, had never been addressed at its root. And in 1986, that tension finally broke. The Rally of Portugal in March 1986 should have been the moment everything changed. It wasn't, but it came close. The crowds that lined the stages of the Portuguese event were simply beyond anything that could be managed with the resources available. Spectators were not just standing at the edge of the road. They were standing in the road, moving aside at the last possible moment as cars approached at speeds that left essentially zero margin for hesitation. Several spectators were struck by cars during the event. The injuries were serious. Miraculously, given the circumstances, none were immediately fatal. But the drivers were shaken in a way that went beyond the normal acceptance of risk that rally racing required. Ari Vatanen, the Finnish champion who had won the 1981 world title and remained one of the most respected voices in the paddock, refused to continue. He stood out of his car on a Portuguese stage and said clearly and publicly that what was happening was unacceptable, that someone was going to be killed. Other drivers supported him. The top competitors effectively went on strike, refusing to start further stages until something was done about the crowd situation. It was an extraordinary moment. These were not timid men. These were people who drove 500-horsepower cars through forests at night and considered it a profession. For them to collectively stop and say this is too dangerous tells you everything you need to know about how bad the situation had become. The FIA responded. They issued warnings. They spoke about improved spectator control at future events. They made noises about taking the safety situation seriously. And then the championship moved on to its next round. Here's what most people don't realize about institutional responses to danger in high-stakes environment. The response is almost always proportional to the most recent visible crisis rather than to the underlying structural problem. Portugal had been frightening but survivable. The official response was therefore serious but not fundamental. Nobody cancelled anything. Nobody rewrote the regulations overnight. The show, as they say, went on. And in May 1986, the show went to Corsica. The Tour de Corse, the Rally of Corsica, is one of the most beautiful and demanding events in the rally calendar. The island sits in the Mediterranean between France and Italy, and its roads wind through mountain terrain that offers views of extraordinary loveliness and drops of terrifying depth. The tarmac stages are narrow, technical, demanding of absolute precision. There is very little room for error and almost no forgiveness when error arrives. Henri Toivonen arrived in Corsica leading the 1986 World Championship standings. He was driving the Lancia Delta S4, the twin-charged monster that he had done so much to develop and that he understood perhaps better than any other driver on the circuit. His co-driver was Sergio Cresto, an Italian-American navigator of considerable experience who had worked with some of the most successful teams in the sport. By all accounts, the partnership was functioning well. Toivonen was fast, controlled, at the top of his considerable abilities. On May 2, 1986, they entered the 18th stage of the rally. The stage wound through mountain terrain approximately 23 kilometers from its start. There were no spectators at the specific point where it happened. No cameras. No witnesses beyond the empty road and the mountains. What we know is this. At some point during that stage, the Lancia Delta S4 left the road. It went over an embankment and dropped into a ravine below. The impact was severe. And then the car caught fire. Now, this is the part of the story that requires a moment of quiet. Because the fire was not like a normal car fire. The composite materials used in the construction of the Delta S4, the same lightweight components that made it so extraordinarily fast, burned with an intensity that rescue crews were completely unprepared for. By the time anyone reached the scene, the car was essentially consumed. Henri Toivonen was 30 years old. Sergio Cresto was 31. Neither survived. The cause of the accident was never definitively established. Mechanical failure was suspected by many who knew the car and the driver. Others considered driver error, though those who had watched Toivonen all season found that explanation difficult to accept. The truth, whatever it was, burned with the car, and the motorsport world grieved with a particular weight that comes when someone genuinely exceptional is gone far too soon. But the tragedies of 1986 were not finished. 2 days later, at the same event in Corsica, Italian driver Attilio Bettega, competing in a Lancia Rally 037, crashed during a stage. Bettega was killed. 2 deaths in 2 days at the same rally. The Lancia team, which had arrived in Corsica as the dominant force in the championship, left with 2 of its people gone. The atmosphere in the paddock was one of shock that went beyond the ordinary processing of motorsport risk. This was something different, something that felt like a reckoning. And then, just 2 weeks later, the reckoning arrived in its most public and undeniable form. The Rally of Argentina. A Ford RS200 driven by Joaquim Santos lost control during a stage and plunged into a crowd of spectators who were standing, as spectators had stood at Group B events for years, right at the edge of the road with effectively no protection between them and the cars. 3 people were killed. More than 30 were injured. They were not drivers. They were not co-drivers who had accepted some version of occupational risk. They were people who had come to watch a race. Families. Individuals who had no professional relationship with the danger involved and every reasonable expectation that they would go home afterward. They did not all go home. In the span of less than 3 weeks, Group B had claimed 6 lives. 2 drivers. 2 co-drivers. 3 spectators. The mathematics of catastrophe had finally become impossible to ignore or manage or respond to with statements and minor adjustments. This is where it gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean this is where the sport finally confronted what it had built. The FIA convened an emergency meeting, and I want you to understand the pressure in that room because it was coming from every direction simultaneously. The manufacturers were there, representing hundreds of millions of dollars in development investment, pleading for reform rather than cancellation. Give us stricter spectator controls. Give us power limits. Give us revised safety requirements for the cars themselves. We can fix this. We have too much invested to walk away. The teams were there, with mechanics and engineers whose entire professional lives were built around these programs. The drivers were there, or at least their voices were, through federation representatives and team principals who understood that the people actually sitting in these cars had complex and divided feelings about what should happen next. And on the other side of the table was a governing body that had just watched 6 people die in 3 weeks and that understood, perhaps for the first time with genuine clarity, that the regulations they had written in 1982 had created something they could no longer control. The arguments went back and forth. They always do in these situations. The manufacturers made genuine and in some cases compelling cases for reform rather than elimination. Peugeot argued that spectator control was the real issue, that properly managed stages with adequate barriers and marshalling could make Group B safe enough to continue. Audi pointed to the mechanical reliability of their cars and suggested that the accidents had been the result of specific failures that could be addressed through targeted regulation. Ford, whose RS200 had been involved in the Argentina tragedy, was in the most difficult position of all, but even they argued for continuation under revised rules rather than outright cancellation. Here's the thing about these arguments. Some of them were not entirely wrong. Better spectator control would have helped. Stricter technical regulations could have reduced peak power output. A more gradual approach to reining in the excesses of Group B might have preserved something of the series while addressing its most dangerous characteristic. But the FIA had a problem that went beyond the specific technical details of any individual argument. They had a credibility problem. They had received warnings. They had seen Portugal. They had issued statements. They had promised improvements. And then 6 people had died anyway. In that context, incremental reform was not going to be sufficient. Not politically. Not publicly. Not in terms of the governing body's own ability to look at itself honestly and conclude that it could manage this situation with anything less than a fundamental change of direction. On May 20, 1986, 18 days after Henri Toivonen and Sergio Cresto died in the mountains of Corsica, the FIA announced that Group B would be banned at the end of the current season. No transition period. No modified regulations that would allow a gentler version of the series to continue. Group B would conclude with the final rally of 1986, and that would be that. The manufacturers were furious. Audi had been developing an entirely new car for the 1987 season, a machine that some within the company believed would have been the fastest Group B car ever built. That project was cancelled overnight. Peugeot had evolution versions of the 205 T16 ready to debut, cars that incorporated lessons learned from 2 championship-winning seasons. Shelve. Ford's RS200 had barely had a full season to prove itself before the curtain came down. The investment across all manufacturers ran into hundreds of millions of dollars, and essentially all of it became overnight either a write-off or a collection of very expensive museum pieces. The drivers had more nuanced reactions, and I think those reactions tell us something important about the human experience of extreme risk. Some were genuinely relieved. Henri, who had stood out of his car in Portugal and said publicly that someone was going to die, felt a complicated mixture of grief for those who had been lost and relief that the specific combination of factors that had made Group B so lethal would no longer be assembled in the same place. He had been right. He had said it out loud. And the cost of being right had been enormous. Others mourned something that, whatever its dangers, had also been the pinnacle of their craft. Walter Röhrl, who had won world championships before Group B and would continue racing afterward, spoke about the cars with a reverence that never entirely disappeared from his voice even decades later. He understood what they were. He understood what they cost. He held both of those things simultaneously. That is what wisdom looks like in the aftermath of something this large. The remaining events of the 1986 season were contested under a shadow that no amount of competitive intensity could entirely lift. Every stage felt like both a celebration and a memorial. The drivers pushed because that is what they did, because the championship still mattered, and because stopping would have felt like a different kind of defeat. But the knowledge that this was ending, that these cars would not return, gave everything a quality of finality that the most routine rally stage does not normally carry. Peugeot won the manufacturers' championship that year. Juha Kankkunen took the driver's title. These were real achievements by real athletes in genuinely extraordinary machines. But they were also achievements that existed in the shadow of what the season had cost. When the final rally of 1986 concluded, an era ended with a completeness that is rare in any sport. There was no gradual transition, no legacy formula where older cars could still compete in a secondary class. Group B simply stopped. The cars went into garages and workshops and eventually into museum collections and private hand. The engineers moved on to other projects. The drivers adapted to the new Group A regulations that replaced Group B, regulations that deliberately and aggressively limited what manufacturers could do. The horsepower dropped. The exotic materials were restricted. The cars became, by the standards of what had come before, almost ordinary. Now, this is where I want to shift the conversation, because the story of Group B doesn't end with the ban. In some ways, that's where the most interesting part of the story begins. The technologies that Group B produced didn't die with the series. They scattered into the automotive world like seeds carried by wind, taking root in places that the engineers who developed them could never entirely have predicted. All-wheel drive is the most obvious example. Before the Audi Quattro, the idea of a performance car with power going to all four wheels was considered either eccentric or irrelevant. After Group B demonstrated what four-wheel drive could do in the most demanding conditions imaginable, the technology spread with remarkable speed. By the early 1990s, all-wheel drive was appearing in mainstream performance cars from manufacturers who had watched what Audi built and drawn the obvious conclusions. Today, it is so common that we barely notice it. SUVs, family saloons, hot hatches, sports cars. The Quattro system that Henri Toivonen and Walter Röhrl and Michel Mouton used to thread through crowds on mountain roads is the direct ancestor of the technology that keeps ordinary drivers safe on wet motorways every single day. The turbocharging systems refined under the extreme pressures of Group B competition found their way into road cars with increasing sophistication through the late 1980s and 1990s. The twin charging concept pioneered by Lancia, that combination of supercharger and turbocharger that gave the Delta S4 its extraordinary power delivery, has reappeared in modern production vehicles from Volkswagen and others. The composite materials that made the cars so light and so devastatingly flammable when they failed evolved into the carbon fiber and advanced polymer components that are now standard in everything from Formula One cars to production supercars. The aerodynamic principles, the active differentials, the suspension geometries developed under Group B regulations, all of these found new homes in the decades that followed. Group B lasted 5 years. Its technical legacy has lasted 40 and is still accumulating. The cars themselves became something beyond mere machines. They became cultural artifacts, objects onto which a particular generation of motorsport fans projected something that went beyond rational appreciation of engineering. Here's what most people don't realize about the collector market for genuine Group B cars today. The prices are not simply high. They are extraordinary in a way that reflects not just rarity but meaning. A verified Audi Sport Quattro S1 E2 in authentic specification can command prices that exceed those of contemporary Formula One cars. A genuine Lancia Delta S4 is rarer still and valued accordingly. The Peugeot 205 T16, of which only the required 200 road versions were built, appears at auction with a frequency that reflects how carefully its owners preserve it and with prices that reflect how desperately other people want it. These are not simply old race cars. They are the physical remains of something that cannot be recreated. The regulations that produced them no longer exist. The corporate environment that funded them no longer exists. The specific combination of ambition and freedom and insufficient caution that made them possible no longer exists. They are unrepeatable, and the market understands that. The human stories from Group B have a similar quality of irreplaceability. Walter Röhrl, now in his late 70s, remains one of the most respected figures in European motorsport. His driving style, that combination of technical precision and absolute commitment, is still studied and discussed. He speaks about Group B with the measured candor of someone who survived something significant and has had decades to process what that survival means. Henri Vatanen continued racing after Group B, suffered a near-fatal accident of his own in 1985 that actually preceded the worst of the 1986 tragedies, recovered with extraordinary determination, and eventually entered politics, serving as a member of the European Parliament. His voice on motorsport safety issues carried the particular authority of someone who had been inside the machine. Michèle Mouton became an advocate for road safety after her racing career, channeling the understanding of vehicle dynamics she had developed in Group B into work that has saved lives of a very different kind than those that the series cost. And Henri Toivonen. There is a version of rally history in which he survives Corsica, completes the 1986 season, potentially wins the championship, and goes on to become one of the defining figures of whatever came next. That version doesn't exist. What exists instead is a legacy built on what people saw him do while he was alive, on the testimony of engineers and teammates and rivals who watched him drive and understood they were seeing something rare. His name is remembered in Finland with the particular weight that attaches to exceptional talent cut short. The Toivonen family remained connected to motorsport. The grief remained connected to the name. Look, the broader lesson of Group B is one that extends well beyond motorsport. It is a lesson about what happens when human ambition operates without sufficient regard for human limitation. The engineers who built these cars were genuinely brilliant. The drivers who drove them were genuinely extraordinary. The manufacturers who funded the programs were pursuing genuine competitive and commercial goals. None of them were villains. But collectively, in the absence of adequate regulatory oversight and with the pressure of competition constantly pushing toward more rather than less, they built something that the real world could not safely contain. The cars outran the infrastructure. The speeds outran the safety measures. And people died who did not have to die. That is the honest summary of Group B: magnificent, revolutionary, transformative, and preventably tragic. Every now and then, at a vintage event somewhere in Europe, one of the old Group B cars rolls out. The crowd goes quiet. The engine fires. And that sound fills the air, that impossible mechanical scream that nothing built since has quite replicated. For just a moment you can feel what it must have been like. The terror and the beauty, completely and permanently inseparable. Some things burn too bright to last. Group B was one of them. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.